Smoke choked the horizon before the first flames even kissed the twilight sky. Out in the unforgiving expanse of the Oak Haven Valley, a man's entire livelihood was turning to ash. This wasn't a dry lightning strike or a careless campfire. This was deliberate, cruel. They thought they could erase their past sins with fire, burying a dark secret deep beneath the soil of a poor dirt farmer who had no earthly protectors. But out of the shimmering heat haze rode a stranger with no name, a heavy iron on his hip, and a stare colder than a prairie winter. They shouldn't have let him see that. Nathaniel Miller fell to his knees, the coarse dirt of his own farm biting into his worn denim trousers. Tears, thick with soot and despair, carved muddy rivers down his weathered face. Before him, 50 acres of prime summer wheat, the culmination of a year's backbreaking labor, his family's salvation from the crushing debt of the local bank, was being consumed by a wall of roaring, crackling orange. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pushed against his chest and made the air taste of sulfur and ruin. Beside him, his 19-year-old daughter, Clara, stood paralyzed, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle the sobs. 100 yards away, sitting comfortably atop a polished black gelding, Abel Higgins watched the destruction with the detached amusement of a man watching a stage play. Higgins was a man whose wealth was built on the broken backs of men like Nathaniel. He wore a tailored wool suit that defied the Texas heat, a gold pocket watch chain gleaming against his vest. Flanking him were his personal instruments of misery, the Boyd brothers, Caleb and Emmett. Caleb, the older and meaner of the two, was currently tossing an empty kerosene tin into the ditch. Emmett was casually lighting a cigarette off a burning stalk of wheat, his face illuminated by the devilish glow of the fire. "I told you, Nathaniel," Higgins's voice carried over the roar of the inferno, smooth and dripping with false sympathy. "The soil here is sour, it's prone to catching, a terrible tragedy, truly. But my offer still stands, $200 for the deed. It's more than fair, considering you'll have nothing to harvest come autumn." Nathaniel didn't answer. He couldn't. The mortgage was due in 3 months. Higgins knew the wheat was Nathaniel's only means of paying it. But what Nathaniel didn't understand was the urgency. Higgins had been a patient vulture for years. Why burn the crop now, just weeks before the harvest? Why risk the wrath of the territorial marshal by committing blatant arson in broad daylight? "Leave us be, Abel," Clara finally screamed, her voice cracking with grief and rage. "You've done enough! You've killed us!" Higgins simply tipped his pristine bowler hat. "Just doing you a favor, little lady, clearing the rot." Emmett chuckled, blowing a cloud of smoke that mingled with the black ash raining down on them. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a heavy walker colt from his hip. "Maybe the old man needs a little more convincing, Mr. Higgins. Seems he's still got some fight in those eyes." "Nah. Don't kill him, Emmett," Higgins instructed lazily. "Dead men can't sign deeds, just encourage him." Emmett grinned, raising the massive revolver, aiming for Nathaniel's kneecap. The hammer clicked back. The sound was sharp, metallic, and terrifyingly final. But the shot never came. Instead, a different sound pierced the heavy ash-filled air. The slow, rhythmic, unhurried clop, clop, clop of hooves on hard-packed dirt. Emmett paused, his finger resting on the trigger, and turned his head. Higgins and Caleb followed his gaze. Even Nathaniel and Clara looked up, their eyes burning from the smoke. From the western ridge, descending through the shimmering heat distortion and the billowing clouds of black smoke, came a rider. He rode a massive, battle-scarred roan stallion that looked as though it had walked through hell and found the temperature lacking. The man upon it was tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a canvas duster that had once been brown, but was now the color of road dust and dried blood. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his eyes, casting his face in an impenetrable shadow. There was nothing overtly threatening about his posture. He slouched slightly in the saddle, his hands resting lightly on the pommel. Yet, the air around him seemed to grow perfectly still. Even the roaring fire seemed to quiet for a fraction of a second as he approached. "We got company," Caleb muttered, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his whip. "Just a drifter," Higgins said, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Tell him the road is closed." The rider didn't stop at the edge of the property line. He guided the roan directly toward the burning field, stopping a mere 20 paces from where Emmett held his gun on Nathaniel. The stranger said nothing. He simply sat there, the heat of the fire washing over him, lifting the hem of his heavy duster to reveal the worn, oiled leather of a gun belt. The holster was tied down to his thigh with a rawhide strip. The grip of his revolver was dark wood, smooth and devoid of any fancy engraving. It was a tool of a trade, well used and impeccably maintained. "You lost, friend?" Emmett sneered, lowering his gun from Nathaniel and pointing it lazily toward the stranger. "This here is private business. I suggest you turn that ugly beast around and ride back into whatever hole you crawled out of." The stranger slowly lifted his head. The shadow of his hat brim shifted just enough to reveal his eyes. They were a startling icy gray. They didn't look at Emmett's gun. They didn't look at Higgins's fine clothes. They looked directly at the fire, and then, slowly, down to the kerosene tin Caleb had tossed in the dirt. "My horse," the stranger spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough like two stones grinding together, carrying effortlessly over the crackling flames. "He's thirsty." Higgins let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Is that right?" "Well, mister, as you can see, we're having a bit of a drought here. No water for strays. Now, move along before my associates here lose their patience." Nathaniel, finding a desperate, foolish courage, croaked out, "There's a trough. By the barn. Help yourself, stranger." The stranger didn't acknowledge Nathaniel. He kept his icy gaze fixed on Emmett. Slowly, deliberately, the stranger swung his right leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He stood at least 6'2", imposing and solid as an oak trunk. He reached up, grabbed the roan's reins, and began walking toward the barn, completely ignoring the three armed men. Emmett's face flushed red with anger. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not when he was holding a Walker colt. "Hey, I'm talking to you, dirtbag!" Emmett spurred his horse, cutting the stranger off. The horse sidestepped, kicking up dust into the stranger's face. The stranger stopped. He didn't brush the dust from his coat. He just looked up at Emmett. "I said," Emmett growled, leveling the gun squarely at the stranger's chest, "the road is closed." Caleb trotted up beside his brother, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Maybe he's deaf, Am. Maybe we need to clean his ears out." Caleb uncoiled his bullwhip, the leather snapping loudly in the dry air. With a flick of his wrist, Caleb sent the whip lashing out. The heavy leather cracked like a gunshot, the tip wrapping tightly around the wooden bucket resting on the edge of the water trough 10 feet away. Caleb yanked and the bucket shattered, spilling the precious cool water into the parched earth. "Oops," Caleb mocked. "Looks like the trough is broken." Clara gasped, clinging tightly to her father. Higgins watched, a smug smile returning to his face. He enjoyed watching the Boyds work. It kept the locals in line. The stranger looked at the spilled water soaking into the mud for a long, agonizing moment. He did absolutely nothing. The wind howled, whipping the smoke around them in a chaotic dance. "You shouldn't have done that," the stranger said softly. "What are you going to do about it?" Emmett taunted, cocking the hammer of his Colt. "You going to cry over spilled water, drifter?" What happened next was not a duel. A duel implies an agreement, a shared moment of preparation. This was an execution, initiated and concluded in the space of a heartbeat. The stranger didn't adopt a stance. He didn't dramatically sweep back his duster. His right hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, blurred. Bang! A single shot rang out, impossibly loud, silencing the crackle of the fire. Emmett Boyd's eyes went wide. The sneer froze on his face. The Walker Colt slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, tumbling to the dirt. A perfectly round, dark red hole appeared dead center in his forehead. He sat motionless in the saddle for 1 second, then 2, before gravity claimed him and he toppled sideways, hitting the ground like a sack of wet grain. The stranger's revolver was already back in its holster. To the untrained eye, it looked as though he had never moved at all. Only the thin wisp of gray smoke curling from beneath the hem of his duster proved otherwise. Silence descended on the farm, heavier and more suffocating than the smoke. Caleb stared at his brother's lifeless body, his mind unable to process the speed of what had just occurred. He dropped his whip, his hand scrambling wildly for the revolver at his hip. "Caleb, don't!" Higgins screamed, his smugness evaporating into sheer, unadulterated terror. The stranger shifted his weight slightly, his hand resting casually near his right thigh. He didn't draw. He just watched Caleb struggle. Caleb froze. His hand hovered an inch from his gun butt. He looked at the stranger's eyes and saw nothing but an endless, empty void. He knew with absolute certainty that if his fingers touched the wood of his grip, he would be dead before he could clear leather. Slowly, his hands went up in the air. Higgins' horse danced nervously, spooked by the gunshot and the smell of fresh blood. Higgins struggled to control the animal, his face pale. "Now see here," Higgins stammered, his voice pitching an octave higher. "There's no need for more violence. Emmett drew first. It was self-defense. We saw it." Higgins was desperately trying to pivot, trying to find an angle with this walking nightmare. "I'm Abel Higgins. I own Oak Haven. Whatever he owed you, I can pay it double. You ride for me now." The stranger finally looked at Higgins. He reached into his coat, pulled out a tobacco pouch, and began rolling a cigarette with slow, methodical precision. "I don't ride for bankers," the stranger said, striking a match off his boot heel and lighting the smoke. He took a long drag, exhaling a cloud that mingled with the destruction around them. "And I don't work for men who burn another man's food." He pointed a finger at Caleb. "Put him over his saddle. Take him back to town. If I see either of you on this man's land again—" The stranger paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "I won't just kill you. I'll burn you." Caleb didn't need to be told twice. Shaking uncontrollably, he dismounted, hauled his brother's bleeding corpse over the saddle of Emmett's horse, and mounted his own. Higgins didn't say another word. He turned his black gelding and spurred it hard, fleeing toward Oak Haven with Caleb right behind him. The stranger stood smoking, watching them until they were swallowed by the dust and the fading light. Then he turned to Nathaniel, who was still kneeling in the dirt, staring at the stranger as if he were an archangel of death sent from the heavens. "Where's the well?" the stranger asked. "The fire's creeping toward your porch." It took 3 hours to beat back the flames that threatened the farmhouse. By the time the moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light over the blackened, smoking ruin of the wheat field, the danger to the structures had passed. Nathaniel and Clara sat on the porch, exhausted, their faces smeared with soot. The stranger sat on an overturned apple barrel near the barn, methodically cleaning his revolver by the light of a single lantern. He had watered his roan, brushed it down, and fed it oats from Nathaniel's dwindling supply. Clara approached him tentatively, carrying a plate of cold salted pork and half a loaf of stale bread. She set it on a crate near him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "for what you did. Emmett Boyd. He was a bad man." The stranger didn't look up from his gun. Bad men usually are. Nathaniel limped over, clutching his ribs. "Mister, I don't know who you are, but you just signed your own death warrant. Abel Higgins practically owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. When the sun comes up, he'll have 20 men riding out here with badges on their chests, calling you a murderer." "Let 'em come," the stranger replied, snapping the cylinder back into his revolver with a satisfying click. He holstered the weapon and picked up the plate, eating the cold food without complaint. "Why did he do it?" the stranger asked, his mouth full of bread. "Bankers usually want the property intact," Nathaniel sighed, slumping into a rocking chair. "That's what makes no sense. The mortgage ain't due till October, and he offered to buy the deed outright today. But he's been agitated. Sending the Boyds out here at night, snooping around my new irrigation ditch. I dug it last week to bring water from the creek to the north acreage." The stranger stopped chewing. He looked out at the smoldering field. "Where is this ditch?" "Out there." Nathaniel pointed toward the center of the blackened acres, right where they started the fire. The stranger set his plate down. He stood up, picked up the lantern, and walked out into the charred field. The heat was still radiating from the ground, warming the soles of his boots. The smell of roasted wheat was sickeningly sweet. He walked for several minutes, his keen eyes scanning the ground. He wasn't looking for survivors or assessing the damage. He was looking at the burn patterns. He reached the center of the field. Here, Nathaniel had dug a trench about 3 feet deep, attempting to channel water. The stranger lowered the lantern. The fire hadn't been started on the edges to sweep across the field with the wind. The deepest charring, the thickest ash, was concentrated right here, along a 20-foot stretch of the newly dug earth. Higgins hadn't just been burning the crop. He'd been trying to bake the earth hard, or perhaps use the fire as a massive distraction to cover up an excavation. The stranger knelt in the warm dirt. He noticed something odd. The side of the trench wasn't just dirt and roots. There was a depression, a cave-in where the earth had recently been disturbed, then hastily covered over by the Boyds before they set the fire. He set the lantern down and began to dig with his bare hands. The dirt was loose. 2 feet down, his fingers brushed against something that wasn't a rock or a root. It felt like thick, hardened leather. He dug faster, clearing the dirt away to reveal a heavy, decaying saddlebag. The leather was rotting, covered in mold and dirt, but the brass buckles were still intact. More importantly, stamped into the leather flap, though faded by time and earth, was a seal. U.S. Army, Quartermaster Department. The stranger pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the rotting leather straps. He pulled the flap back. Inside, dull and tarnished by years of burial, lay rows of heavy, tightly packed canvas sacks. One of them had rotted through. The stranger reached in and pulled out a handful of the contents, holding it up to the lantern light. Gold, double eagles, mint condition, dozens of them spilling from his hand back into the bag. This wasn't a farmer's hidden stash. This was payroll. Military payroll. The stranger stood up, looking back toward the lights of Oakhaven glittering in the distance. The pieces fell into place with the precision of a well-oiled gunlock. Abel Higgins wasn't just a corrupt banker. 15 years ago, during the chaos of the Civil War, a Union payroll wagon had vanished in this territory. The escorting soldiers had been found slaughtered, their bodies burned beyond recognition. The gold was never recovered. The lead suspect had been a Union quartermaster who deserted his post the very same night. A quartermaster who had likely taken his stolen fortune, buried it out here in the middle of nowhere, and waited for the war to end and the heat to die down. A quartermaster who reinvented himself as a wealthy banker named Abel Higgins, slowly buying up the land around his hidden treasure to ensure it remained undisturbed, until a poor dirt farmer named Nathaniel Miller decided to dig an irrigation ditch right over the top of a small fortune. Higgins panicked. He needed Nathaniel gone immediately before the farmer dug another foot deeper. And when Nathaniel refused to sell, Higgins opted to burn the field down, planning to use the charred earth as an excuse to bring in his own men to clear the debris and secretly extract the gold. The stranger dropped the gold coins back into the bag. He covered it back up with dirt, masking the excavation. They were burning the crops to hide a slaughter, to hide treason, and to protect a fortune bathed in blood. The stranger walked back to the farmhouse. He blew out the lantern. "Mr. Miller," the stranger said from the shadows of the porch. Nathaniel jumped slightly. "Yes?" "Pack a wagon. Get your daughter. Head south to San Antonio tonight. Don't stop for anything." "But, my land." "Your land is a graveyard," the stranger said coldly. "And by tomorrow morning, it's going to be a battlefield. Higgins isn't coming back with the sheriff. He's coming back with every gun thug he can buy, and he's not going to leave any witnesses." Clara stood up, terrified. "What are you going to do?" The stranger turned his gaze toward the road leading to town. He adjusted the belt on his thigh. "I'm going to teach Mr. Higgins," the stranger whispered into the dark, "that some things buried in the dirt bite back when you dig them up." The midnight air was thick with the lingering stench of burnt wheat, a cloying reminder of the violence that had barely begun. Nathaniel Miller's hands shook uncontrollably as he hitched his 2 remaining draft mules to the splintered wooden wagon. Inside, Clara was frantically stuffing quilts, a few cast-iron skillets, and whatever meager provisions had survived the day into flour sacks. She was crying, a silent, steady stream of tears that spoke of a home lost and a terrifying, uncertain future. The stranger stood by the barn, watching them with those impassive, glacial eyes. He held a heavy canvas sack in his left hand. "Mr. Miller," the stranger called out, his voice cutting through the nervous jingling of the mule harnesses. Nathaniel turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat. We're going just like you said. The Lord knows how we'll make it to San Antonio with barely $3 to our name." The stranger walked forward and tossed the heavy canvas sack into the back of the wagon. It landed with a dull metallic clink that sounded incredibly heavy for its size. "What's this?" Nathaniel asked, his brow furrowing as he reached for the drawstrings. "Severance pay," the stranger replied evenly. "From the United States government. Don't spend it all in one town and melt the coins down before you try to bank them. The eagles are stamped." Nathaniel opened the sack, and the moonlight caught the dull, unmistakable gleam of raw wealth. He gasped, dropping the bag as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Clara peered over the wagon buckboard, her eyes widening. "Mister, this is gold," Nathaniel stammered, stepping back. "We can't take this. It's stolen. It's yours now," the stranger interrupted. "Higgins burned your livelihood to hide it. Consider it compensation for your crop, your land, and the trouble you're about to outrun. Now, get moving. Take the old cattle trail south. Do not take the main road." Though Nathaniel looked from the gold to the stranger, overwhelming gratitude warring with sheer terror in his chest. "I don't know who you are, mister. I don't know why you're doing this for us." "I'm not doing it for you," the stranger said, turning his back on them and walking toward the farmhouse. "I'm doing it to him." Within 10 minutes, the wagon was a disappearing shadow against the southern horizon. The stranger was entirely alone on the property. He didn't sleep. He didn't rest. He moved with the practiced, chilling efficiency of a man who had orchestrated wholesale slaughter before. He started in the barn. He found a barrel of kerosene Nathaniel used for the lanterns and carefully poured a thick, pungent trail across the dry straw, winding it around the support beams and out the back door. Next, he moved to the farmhouse. He dragged the heavy oak dining table to the front window, barricading the lower half while leaving a perfect firing slit. He went into the kitchen and found 3 sealed jars of preserving wax and a rusted tin of black powder Nathaniel used for blasting tree stumps. He spent an hour packing the powder into the jars, creating crude but devastating explosives, placing them strategically under the porch steps and near the water trough. Meanwhile, 5 miles away in the town of Oak Haven, the saloon was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Abel Higgins stood behind the mahogany bar, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey in his trembling hand. Spread out before him were 20 of the hardest, most ruthless men money could buy in the territory. Sheriff Jim Coulter, a massive man with a gut that strained against his leather gun belt, leaned against a supporting pillar, picking his teeth with a splinter. He wore a tin star, but his allegiance belonged entirely to Higgins's payroll. "You're telling me," Coulter grumbled, his voice like gravel in a tin pan, "that one drifter shot Emmett Boyd dead in the blink of an eye, and now we gotta ride out there in the dark like a pack of spooked coyotes?" "He's not just a drifter," Higgins snapped, slamming his fist on the bar. The memory of those icy gray eyes still made his skin crawl. He's dangerous. He told Caleb he'd burn us if we went back. "Let him try," drawled a voice from the corner booth. The saloon went quiet. Out of the shadows stepped Deacon Cole. He was a lean, hollow-cheeked killer from Missouri, dressed entirely in black broadcloth. He carried 2 Remington New Model Army revolvers, their grips worn smooth from use. Deacon wasn't a brawler. He was a surgeon with a gun, a man who killed without passion or hesitation. Higgins had kept him on retainer for exactly this kind of problem. "You paying double for night work, mister?" "Higgins?" Deacon asked, his pale blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I'm paying triple," Higgins said desperately, "but he has to die tonight. And Nathaniel Miller and his daughter, too. Nobody leaves that farm breathing, understand?" Higgins couldn't tell them the real reason. He couldn't tell them about the Union gold buried in the dirt. He had received a telegram just yesterday from a contact in Austin. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had reopened the cold case of the missing payroll. They had an agent heading to Oakhaven within the week. Higgins needed that gold dug up, melted down, and moved tonight, or his entire empire and his life would end at the end of a hangman's rope. "Saddle up, boys," Sheriff Colder barked, spitting his toothpick onto the floorboards. "Looks like we're going hunting." The sky in the east was just beginning to bleed, a sickly, pale purple when the posse arrived at the edge of the Miller property. The air was dead calm, amplifying the sound of 20 horses snorting and stamping their hooves. Sheriff Coulter signaled for the men to halt. He peered through the gloom toward the farmhouse. It was pitch black. No lanterns burned in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. The smoldering wheat field to their right cast an eerie, reddish glow over the landscape. "Looks deserted," muttered Wyatt Finch, a young, nervous kid who was only riding along because he owed Higgins gambling debts. "Maybe they cut and run." "Don't be stupid," Deacon Cole whispered, pulling his black horse alongside the sheriff's. "Men like the one Higgins described don't run. They wait." "Spread out," Coulter ordered, waving his arm. "Surround the house. Jebediah, take 3 men and check the barn. If you see anything move, put a hole in it." Jebediah Cross, a scarred former buffalo hunter, nodded. He dismounted, pulling a heavy Sharps rifle from his scabbard. He motioned for 3 men to follow him, and they crept toward the dark, looming shape of the barn. Inside the farmhouse, kneeling behind the barricaded window, the stranger watched them through the sights of an Winchester 1873 repeating rifle. He had traded for it a year ago, preferring its magazine capacity over heavier, slower buffalo guns. He let out a slow, controlled breath, his heart beating at a steady, resting pace. He was completely detached from the fear of death. He had died inside 15 years ago on a muddy road surrounded by burning wagons. This was just the mechanical process of balancing the scales. He watched Jebediah and the 3 men approach the barn doors. They didn't bother to be quiet. Jebediah kicked the large wooden door open, his rifle raised. "Empty!" Jebediah yelled back toward the posse. "Nothing but mulch." From his position in the house, the stranger lowered the Winchester and picked up the Sharps rifle he had taken from Emmett Boyd's saddle the day before. He aimed not at a man, but at a specific patch of dirt 20 yards behind the barn. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy bullet tore through the air and struck the flint rock the stranger had wedged into the dirt, right where the trail of kerosene ended. The spark caught instantly. A line of blue flame raced across the ground like a striking snake, zipping straight into the back of the barn. "What the hell is that?" Wyatt Finch cried out from the posse line. Before anyone could answer, the fire reached the kerosene-soaked straw and the 50-pound barrel of black powder Nathaniel had stored near the back wall. The explosion tore the pre-dawn silence to shreds. It was deafening, a concussive roar that physically lifted men off their horses. The roof of the barn detached entirely. flying 50 feet into the air in a massive fireball of splintered wood, burning hay, and lethal shrapnel. Jebediah Cross and his 3 men ceased to exist in an instant, consumed by the inferno. Horses screamed in sheer terror, bucking wildly. Half the posse was thrown to the dirt, their mounts fleeing into the darkness. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Higgins's men. "Ambush!" Coulter screamed, struggling to control his terrified bay gelding. "Fire at the house! Fire!" A hail of lead rained down on the Miller farmhouse. Bullets shattered the windows, splintered the siding, and punched holes through the thin walls. The stranger kept his head down, waiting for the initial volley to pause as men reloaded. The moment the gunfire slackened, the stranger popped up. He leveled the Winchester. He didn't fire wildly into the dark. He aimed at the muzzle flashes. Crack, crack, crack. 3 shots. 3 men dropped into the dust, clutching their chests and throats. The stranger vanished back below the barricade before the posse could return fire. "He's in the parlor window!" someone shouted. "Rush him! There's only one of him!" Coulter bellowed, trying to rally his terrified men. 5 men, emboldened by the sheriff's shouting, leapt from the cover of a low stone wall and charged across the open yard toward the front porch. The stranger waited until they were halfway across. Then he grabbed his heavy revolver, aimed at the porch steps, and fired a single shot into the crude wax jar explosive he had buried there. A geyser of dirt, wood splinters, and fire erupted right beneath the charging men's feet. 2 were killed instantly by the blast, thrown backward like rag dolls. The other 3 lay screaming in the dirt, their legs torn by shrapnel. The posse broke. They were hired guns, bullies used to intimidating unarmed farmers. They were not soldiers, and they were not prepared for a tactical, merciless slaughter. Men began to crawl backward, abandoning their friends, desperately looking for their horses. "Stand your ground, you cowards!" Abel Higgins shrieked from the back of the line, his face a mask of furious desperation. "I'll kill the first man who runs." Deacon Cole ignored the banker. He had dismounted during the initial explosion and was using the chaos to move. He slipped into the smoldering ruins of the wheat field, using the thick knee-high ash and the rolling smoke to conceal his approach. He realized the stranger was controlling the engagement from the front of the house. If Deacon could flank him, get to the back door, he could end this. Inside, the stranger reloaded his Winchester, sliding the brass cartridges through the loading gate with practiced rhythmic motions. He glanced out the back window. He saw the subtle disturbance in the ash of the wheat field, a trail being carved through the soot. A professional. The stranger left the barricade. He walked silently through the kitchen, pushed the back door open, and stepped out into the cool morning air, drawing his revolver. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the battlefield. The front yard of the Miller farm was a slaughterhouse. 9 of Higgins's men were dead or dying. The barn was a burning skeleton, the crackle of its flames the only sound breaking the sudden heavy silence. Sheriff Coulter had seen enough. The promised money wasn't worth a shallow grave. He scrambled onto his horse, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the reins. "Where are you going?" Higgins screamed, grabbing the horse's bridle. "I'm going back to town, Abel," Coulter yelled, his eyes wide with panic. "That ain't a man in there, that's a demon. Keep your damn money." Coulter spurred his horse, yanking the bridle from Higgins's grasp. He turned back down the road toward Oakhaven. Higgins watched him go, a cold, dark fury settling over him. If the sheriff ran, the rest of the men would follow. If they followed, the gold stayed buried. The Pinkertons would arrive. He would hang. Higgins calmly drew a silver-plated derringer from his vest pocket. He aimed at the broad back of the fleeing sheriff. Bang! The small-caliber bullet hit Coulter square in the spine. The massive sheriff stiffened, let out a wet gasp, and tumbled backward off his horse, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He didn't move again. The remaining 4 men of the posse froze, staring at their employer in horror. "Anyone else want to resign?" Higgins asked softly. his voice trembling with manic edge. He pointed toward the smoldering wheat field. "Get in there. Dig where the ditch is. Dig!" While Higgins forced his terrified survivors into the ash, a different kind of confrontation was happening behind the farmhouse. Deacon Cole crept through the soot, his twin Remingtons drawn and cocked. He moved like a ghost, his boots making barely a whisper against the charred earth. He rounded the corner of the house, expecting to catch the stranger looking out a window. Instead, he found the stranger standing in the open yard, 20 feet away, waiting for him. Deacon stopped. For the first time in his miserable, blood-soaked life, a flicker of genuine apprehension settled in his gut. The stranger's stance was perfectly relaxed, his right hand hanging loose by his side, the dark wood of his revolver grip catching the early morning sun. "You're good," Deacon said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried in the quiet. "Set a hell of a trap, but you made a mistake coming outside." "No mistake," the stranger replied, his voice rough and devoid of emotion. "You were going to try the back door. Figured I'd save you the walk." Deacon narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you? You ain't no dirt farmer's kin. You move like cavalry. You fight like cavalry." The stranger's gray eyes seemed to darken. The morning breeze kicked up a swirl of black ash around his boots. 15 years ago, the stranger said slowly, a wagon train was ambushed in the canyon north of here. 10 good men were shot to pieces by their own quartermaster while they slept. Men who trusted him. Men who left families behind. Deacon's brow furrowed. "That missing Union gold, that's what this is about? You're a bounty hunter?" "I'm no hunter," the stranger said softly. He reached up with his left hand and slowly pulled back the collar of his duster and the cotton shirt beneath it. Across his collarbone and neck was a massive, horrific burn scar, the kind left by a close-range muzzle flash and burning wagon canvas. It was a miracle he had survived it. "I'm the one who didn't burn," the stranger whispered. Deacon's eyes widened. He realized in a split second that this wasn't about money. This wasn't a job. This was a ghost who had spent a decade and a half clawing his way out of hell to exact revenge. Deacon didn't speak again. He brought both Remingtons up, his fingers tightening on the triggers, but the ghost was faster. The stranger drew, cocked, and fired in a singular fluid motion that defied human reflex. His revolver roared, spitting a gout of flame. Deacon's right gun discharged into the dirt as a .45 caliber slug took him squarely in the chest, shattering his sternum. The impact lifted him off his feet, dropping him hard onto his back in the soot. He gasped for air that his lungs could no longer hold, his twin revolvers slipping from his grasp. He stared up at the clear morning sky, the light fading from his eyes, until he finally went still. The stranger didn't linger. He reloaded his single spent chamber and walked toward the center of the charred field. Higgins had forced his men to dig. They were using their hands, pieces of burnt wood, desperate to unearth whatever their crazed boss was looking for. "I see it!" Wyatt Finch cried out, his hands scraping against the rotting leather of the saddlebag the stranger had uncovered the night before. "It's a bag! It's heavy!" "Pull it up!" Higgins screamed, tears of manic joy streaming down his face. "Pull it up, you fools!" Wyatt dragged the heavy bag out of the dirt. The rotting leather finally gave way entirely, ripping open, but gold coins didn't spill out. Instead, a cascade of heavy, jagged lead slugs, old iron horseshoes, and heavy river rocks tumbled into the ash. Higgins stared at the rocks, his mind shattered. He dropped to his knees, his hands frantically sifting through the dirt and the iron, looking for the yellow gleam of his stolen salvation. "Where is it?" Higgins wailed, his voice cracking. "Where is my gold?" "It's halfway to San Antonio," a voice boomed behind him. Higgins spun around, still on his knees. The 4 remaining posse members dropped their makeshift digging tools and raised their hands in the air, wanting no part of the man standing 30 feet away. The stranger stood amidst the ruins of the wheat field, the smoke curling around him like a shroud. He looked down at Higgins, not with anger, but with the cold, absolute judgment of an executioner. "You," Higgins gasped, pointing a trembling finger at the stranger. "You took it. You stole my life." "I took back what you stole, quartermaster," the stranger said. "From dead men." Higgins's eyes widened in horrified recognition. He looked at the stranger's face, really looked at it, past the weathering of 15 years, past the beard and the shadow of the hat. He saw the ghost of the young corporal he had shot and left for dead in a burning wagon. "No," Higgins whispered, scrambling backward like a crab in the dirt. "No, you're dead. I watched you burn." "Fire cleanses, Abel," the stranger said softly, raising his revolver and pointing it steadily at Higgins's chest. "But some stains don't wash out." Higgins fumbled frantically for his silver derringer, raising it toward the stranger in a final, pathetic act of defiance. The stranger didn't blink. He pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the empty valley, a definitive, echoing punctuation to a 15-year sentence. Abel Higgins fell backward into the ash of the very field he had burned, dead before his head hit the dirt. The 4 surviving men of the posse stood frozen, terrified to breathe. The stranger slowly lowered his gun. He looked at the men, then pointed toward the road leading to Oak Haven. "Walk!" he commanded. They ran. The stranger stood alone in the center of the ruined farm. The sun was fully up now, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the carnage. The scales were balanced. The ghosts of the canyon could finally rest. He walked over to his massive roan stallion, which had remained calmly tied to a sturdy oak tree near the front of the property, untouched by the violence. He swung himself into the saddle, adjusting his duster. He didn't look back at the bodies, or the burning barn, or the man he had hunted for a decade and a half. He turned the horse west, toward the endless, untamed expanse of the frontier, and rode slowly away, swallowed by the vastness of the land, a nameless shadow returning to the wild. 3 days after the earth drank the blood of Abel Higgins and his hired killers, the buzzards were still circling the skies above Oak Haven. The town had fallen into a state of paralyzed terror. Nobody dared ride out to the Miller farm to claim the dead. The surviving posse members had staggered into the saloon, babbling incoherently about a ghost that breathed fire and moved faster than a striking diamondback. The local undertaker, a pragmatic man named Thaddeus Boone, simply locked his doors and waited for the territorial marshals to arrive. But the marshals didn't arrive first. On the morning of the 4th day, a lone rider stepped off the morning stagecoach. He didn't look like a lawman, nor did he look like a drifter. He wore a sharply tailored gray suit, a bowler hat, and round spectacles that magnified sharp, calculating brown eyes. He carried a leather Gladstone bag and walked with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who dealt exclusively in facts, not rumors. His name was Arthur Pendleton, senior operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, operating out of the Chicago office. Pendleton walked straight to the sheriff's office, stepping over a puddle of dried tobacco spit on the porch. He found the deputy, a terrified kid of 19, hiding behind the desk with a shotgun resting on his lap. "I am Agent Pendleton," he announced, his voice clipped and resonant. "I'm looking for Sheriff Jim Coulter. I sent a telegram 5 days ago regarding a federal investigation." The deputy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sheriff Coulter is dead, mister. Shot in the back out at the Miller place. Most of the men in this town who knew how to pull a trigger are dead out there." Pendleton didn't gasp or express shock. He simply opened his leather bag, pulled out a small black notebook, and uncapped a fountain pen. "I see. And who precisely killed the sheriff?" "A demon," the deputy whispered. "Rode a scarred-up roan, had eyes like winter ice. He slaughtered Deacon Cole in a fair draw and blew the rest of them to kingdom come." "Demons do not use explosives, nor do they engage in quick draws," Pendleton said dryly, jotting down notes. "They also do not steal government property, which is what I am here to recover. I need a horse, deputy, and a wagon for the bodies. "We are going to the Miller farm." When Pendleton arrived at the ruined acreage, he didn't balk at the stench or the sight of the bloated corpses. He tied a handkerchief around his face and went to work. He was a pioneer in what the agency called crime scene reconstruction. He walked the perimeter. He measured the distance from the barricaded farmhouse window to the blasted remains of the barn. He knelt in the ash, examining the wax fragments of the makeshift explosives. "Tactical," Pendleton murmured to himself, sketching the layout in his notebook. "Military precision. Use of cover, choke points, and psychological warfare." He eventually made his way to the center of the burnt wheat field. He found the excavated trench and the shredded remains of the U.S. Army saddlebags. He knelt, picking up a piece of the rotting leather, rubbing the faded gold seal between his thumb and forefinger. He then looked at the dead body of Abel Higgins, lying a few yards away, a single bullet hole through his heart. Pendleton reached into Higgins's vest pocket and retrieved a silver pocket watch. He popped it open. Inside was a faded daguerreotype of a young man in a Union quartermaster uniform. "So the rumors were true, Abel," Pendleton said softly to the corpse. "You didn't just desert. You butchered your own men for a heavy saddlebag, buried it, and bought a town with the patience of a saint. But someone dug it up." Pendleton walked back to the farmhouse. He examined the fresh wagon tracks leading out of the barn, heading south. They were deep, much deeper than a wagon carrying standard provisions. "A heavy load," Pendleton noted. "2 mules, driven hard. They have a 3-day head start, but a wagon loaded with 200 pounds of solid gold doesn't move fast." He turned to the deputy, who was shivering despite the Texas heat. "Gather a posse to bury these men. I am riding south." "You're going after the demon?" the deputy asked, horrified. "I'm going after the gold, deputy. The man who orchestrated the Canyon Massacre of 1864 is lying dead in the dirt. My mandate is the recovery of federal assets." Pendleton checked the load in his Colt double-action revolver. "And Pinkertons always balance the ledger." 200 miles south, the landscape had shifted from the rolling plains of Oak Haven to the jagged, unforgiving scrubland of the Rio Grande Valley. A massive thunderstorm was brewing in the west, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and black. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the promise of a deluge. Nathaniel Miller cracked the reins over the backs of his exhausted mules. His hands were blistered, his face hollowed out by days of sleepless paranoia. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk made him reach for the rusty shotgun resting beside his leg. In the back of the wagon, Clara sat huddled under a woolen blanket, staring blankly at the heavy canvas sacks resting on the floorboards. The gold didn't feel like a blessing anymore. It felt like a curse, a radioactive anchor tied around their necks. "We need to stop, Pa," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "The mules are foaming, and the storm is going to break soon." "We can't stop," Nathaniel rasped, his eyes darting frantically at the horizon. "San Antonio's only 2 days' ride. We can lose ourselves in the city. We stop now. Higgins' ghosts will catch us." "Higgins is dead," Clara cried out. "The stranger killed him. He killed all of them." "But someone will come looking for this." Nathaniel kicked the heavy sack with his boot. "You think you can just walk away with the United States Treasury and nobody comes asking questions?" As if summoned by his worst fears, a voice carried over the rising wind. "Pull the wagon over, Mr. Miller. Keep your hands where I can see them." Nathaniel's heart stopped. He yanked the reins, bringing the braying mules to a halt. 50 yards ahead, blocking the narrow trail, sat Arthur Pendleton on a sleek chestnut mare. The Pinkerton operative had ridden relentlessly, swapping horses at way stations, tracking the deep ruts of the heavy wagon. He had his double-action Colt drawn, resting casually on the pommel of his saddle. Nathaniel slowly raised his hands, the shotgun sliding off his lap onto the floorboards. Who are you?" Nathaniel stammered. "Arthur Pendleton." "Pinkerton National Detective Agency," he announced, nudging his horse forward until he was 10 feet from the wagon. He tipped his bowler hat to Clara. "Apologies for the fright, miss. I have no quarrel with you or your father. You are victims of Abel Higgins, just like the men he murdered 15 years ago." "Then let us pass," Nathaniel begged, his voice cracking. "He burned my farm. He took everything. This is all we have to start over." "Well, that gold does not belong to Abel Higgins, and it does not belong to you," Pendleton said firmly, though his eyes held a flicker of sympathy. "It is stolen federal payroll. It is blood money, Mr. Miller. Hand it over, and you can ride to San Antonio as free citizens. Keep it, and I will be forced to arrest you for the possession of stolen government property." Nathaniel looked at the sacks. He thought of the barren, blackened earth of Oakhaven. He thought of Clara's future, reduced to ash by a corrupt banker. A desperate, irrational anger flared in his chest. He slowly lowered his right hand toward the floorboards, his fingers brushing the cold iron of the shotgun barrel. "Don't do it, Mr. Miller," Pendleton warned, cocking the hammer of his Colt. The metallic click was sharp against the rumbling thunder. "I am not a monster, but I am a man of the law. Do not make me widow your daughter." "The law didn't protect us when Higgins set our crops on fire," Nathaniel yelled, tears streaming down his dirt-caked face. "The law stood by and watched. We earned this. We paid for it in blood." "Drop the gun, Nathaniel." The voice didn't come from Pendleton. It didn't come from the wagon. It came from the rocky ridge directly to Pendleton's right. Pendleton froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing atop a massive limestone boulder, silhouetted against the boiling black storm clouds, was the nameless stranger. He wore the same blood-stained road dust duster. His wide-brimmed hat obscured his eyes, but his presence was as overwhelming as the approaching storm. His massive roan stallion stood quietly behind him. The stranger had a Winchester repeating rifle leveled squarely at Pendleton's chest. "I told you to take the old cattle trail, Nathaniel," the stranger called down, his voice cutting through the wind like a rusted saw blade. "You drifted east. Made you easy to track." Pendleton felt a bead of cold sweat trace its way down his spine. He was a professional, but he knew death when he looked at it. He kept his Colt aimed at the wagon, but spoke to the man on the ridge. "You're the shooter from Oakhaven," Pendleton stated, his mind racing. "The one they called a demon." I've been called worse by better men," the stranger replied. He stepped down from the boulder, sliding effortlessly down the scree slope, his rifle never wavering. He stopped 20 paces from Pendleton. "You are interfering with a federal investigation," Pendleton said, his voice remarkably steady. "That gold is the property of the United States Army." "That gold," the stranger corrected, "was the property of 10 men who never got to go home. 10 men who were shot in their sleep by a quartermaster who wanted to live like a king. The government wrote them off as casualties of war. The government didn't give a damn." Pendleton narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the stranger. The military posture, the righteous anger, the timeline. "The canyon ambush of '64, Pendleton breathed, the pieces finally snapping together in his brilliant analytical mind. They found 10 bodies in the burned wagons, but the manifest listed an escort of 11. Corporal William Vance was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The stranger didn't flinch at the name, but a muscle in his jaw feathered. "Names burn away just like flesh, Pinkerton. I'm just a man balancing a scale." "You survived," Pendleton said, awe mixing with his professional detachment. "You survived the fire. You hunted him for 15 years, and when you found him, you found his victims." Pendleton gestured to Nathaniel and Clara. "Higgins owed a debt," the stranger said softly. "The Millers collected it. That gold stays in the wagon." Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that made the mules shriek. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dry earth with loud, wet smacks. A standoff. A Pinkerton agent armed with a revolver, bound by the strict, unyielding letters of the law. A ghost armed with a Winchester, bound by the ruthless, bloody mathematics of frontier justice. "If I let them ride away," Pendleton said, the rain beginning to spot his immaculate gray suit, "I fail my mandate. The agency will hunt them. They will hunt you. You know how Pinkertons work. We do not stop." "I know," the stranger said, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "That's why you're going to go back to Chicago and tell them you recovered the payload, but the gold was lost to the elements." "And what proof will I offer my superiors?" Pendleton scoffed. "A story about a ghost?" The stranger slowly reached into the deep pocket of his duster with his free hand. He pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch, much smaller than the canvas sacks in the wagon. He tossed it through the rain. Pendleton caught it with his left hand. He opened the drawstrings. Inside, glittering dull yellow in the stormlight, were a dozen heavy gold nuggets. Raw, unminted gold, not the stamped double eagles of the Army payroll. Tucked beneath the gold was a tarnished, blood-stained silver dog tag. Abel Higgins, quartermaster. "That's $20,000 in raw California gold," the stranger said, "taken off a bounty in Nevada 3 years ago. It's clean, unmarked. It covers the agency's recovery fee, and it covers your silence. The dog tag proves you found the traitor and dealt with him." Pendleton looked at the raw gold, then at the dog tag. He was a man of the law, but he was also a pragmatist. Returning empty-handed meant failure. Returning with the dog tag of the orchestrator and enough gold to satisfy the agency's bottom line was a victory, albeit an unorthodox one. He looked at Nathaniel, who was trembling, clutching his daughter. He looked at the shattered lives Higgins had left in his wake. To take the Army gold now would simply be a continuation of Higgins's cruelty. Pendleton slowly uncocked his Colt and slid it back into his shoulder holster. The year. The manifest for the 1864 payroll was notoriously inaccurate, Pendleton said loudly, speaking over the roar of the pouring rain. Due to the fire in the canyon, the exact amount of the payload was deemed unrecoverable. The operative in charge, myself, closed the case upon confirming the death of the primary suspect, Quartermaster Higgins. Nathaniel let out a sob of absolute relief, dropping his head into his hands. The stranger lowered his Winchester. He gave Pendleton a single respectful nod. "Ride south, Mr. Miller," Pendleton instructed, turning his horse back toward the north. "When you get to San Antonio, melt those coins down immediately. Open a hardware store, buy a ranch, live a quiet life. Do not ever speak of Oak Haven again." "We won't," Clara promised, crying freely now. She looked at the stranger standing in the pouring rain. "Thank you, whoever you are. Thank you." The stranger didn't say, "You're welcome." He didn't offer a charming smile or a tip of his hat. He simply turned, walked back up the scree slope, and mounted his roan stallion. Pendleton watched him go. "You can't ride the frontier forever, Corporal. Eventually, the ghosts stop chasing you and you have to figure out how to live." "The ghosts don't chase me, Pinkerton," the stranger called back, his voice fading into the thunder. "I ride with them." "Be tuve." The stranger spurred his horse, disappearing over the ridge, swallowed entirely by the storm and the vast, unwritten history of the American West. He left behind a dead tyrant, a rich dirt farmer, and a detective who had learned that sometimes the law has to step aside to let true justice pass. Nathaniel Miller cracked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, heavy with the weight of a bloody past, rolling slowly toward the promise of a golden future. And there you have it, folks. The blood-soaked saga of Oak Haven comes to a thrilling close. From the burning wheat fields to the explosive showdown at the farmhouse, and finally a tense standoff in the pouring rain, our nameless gunman proved that the frontier has its own brand of justice. He balanced a 15-year-old ledger and gave a desperate family a second chance at life, fading back into the myths of the Wild West where he belongs. Did you expect that incredible twist with the Pinkerton detective? Let me know your favorite moment down in the comments. If you loved this gritty, real-life inspired Western drama, please smash that like button and share this video with your friends to help the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another epic storytelling adventure. Until next time, keep your powder dry and ride safe.